The collapse of Syria and the Assad regime explained. This is the country of Syria, even split among many different rebel forces, but ultimately under the control of Bashar al-Assad. The red section of the map is important as not only does Assad control this, but it has also become a haven for Russian and Iranian support. In fact, it is through these corridors that Iran secretly smuggled weapons to Hezbollah. Just a few days later, this is the Syrian map with HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, now firmly in control of not only its land, but almost 70% of Syria. But what the West and many of its allies have been trying for decades have happened in just a few days. So, how did HTS, under the leadership of former ISIS supporter Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, manage to topple a regime spanning almost 5 decades? Today, we unravel these secrets and find out how Syria and the Assad regime finally collapsed, using somewhat unconventional tactics for a war in the Middle East. The Syrian Civil War. The Syrian Civil War kicked off on March 15, 2011. In fact, most sources still classify Syria as a war zone, despite the recent events crippling Assad. In fact, Assad and his reign of terror are solely responsible for the rise of this war, with many locals becoming discontent with the current status quo. Back in 2011, major protests erupted, which all formed part of the wider Arab Spring protests across the region. However, Assad and its security forces would quickly suppress these protests, leading to tens of thousands of deaths and detentions. Many of these would only be uncovered in recent weeks, with the liberation of the notorious Sinai prison. Also dubbed as the human slaughterhouse. Violence naturally peaked during 2012 and 2017 with the rise of the Islamic State across the Middle East. Under its rule, tens of thousands of people were executed to establish an Islamic caliphate. The United States and the West would quickly intervene, destroying ISIS and slowly dismantling its operations of terror. But by 2020, the Syrian government under Assad was once again in power, and this time the regime was hell-bent on consolidating power. As you can see, the government controlled about 2/3 of the country once ISIS was mostly ousted from control. However, ISIS still has a few independent cells operating in the central parts of the country. The war continued, but HTS and other rebel groups in the religion, like the SDF, Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, Russia, and even a few Turkish factions, would continue to skirmish. Thanks to support from Russian and Iranian backers, fighting between Assad and various rebel groups would largely subside. However, one man who had been in control of the Idlib region, Muhammad al-Jawlani, was not about to see people continue to be tortured, setting off a chain of events that would see the end of a 50-year dictatorship, the fall of Syria and Assad. On November 27, 2024, a coalition of Syrian opposition groups called the Military Operation Command launched one of the most devastating offensives. What is most surprising is that this offensive was completely unconventional. Instead of taking the traditional route of violence, HTS, who became the de facto leader of the coalition, chose a tactic that is very similar to what Israeli forces like the IDF had been using against Hamas and Hezbollah. The first target on the list was the Aleppo governorate, which would fall in about a day, with virtually no violence. In fact, many Syrian defense soldiers laid down their arms when the HTS marched into town. This is not to say a few smaller skirmishes didn't break out. Numerous skirmishes in and around the Aleppo region, stretching to Hama, would also kick off. According to some statisticians, about 746 people lost their lives in November alone, making it the deadliest month in 5 years. But the march to Hama was in full swing. December the 1st would be another deadly day, the HTS forces now marching on Hama. Keep in mind that much like the IDF, the coalition warned citizens and military operators that they could lay down their arms and they would be treated with respect and not murdered. This would also bring Russia into the conflict, where about 24 people would be killed thanks to the Russian airstrikes on Aleppo and Idlib. But there was no stopping the advances when Hama fell in just a few days, with the Assad regime claiming to have not defended the town, to not bring war to the civilians. Over the next few days, from December 2nd to December 7th, coalition forces continued their advance to Damascus, where Assad was said to be hiding. Finally, on December 8th, HTS forces were seen entering the capital of Damascus, sparking many questions about Bashar al-Assad and his fall from power. In fact, many Syrian army forces laid down their arms, with Jilani reiterating full amnesty for any soldiers who served in the Syrian army. Images also continued to circulate about how well hostages were being treated, creating a sense of inclusion. This is very similar to what happened in 2021 when the Taliban officially returned to power in Afghanistan. Numerous videos could be seen of statues being torn down and people celebrating their liberation at the hands of HTS. By the time Damascus had fallen, the burning question on the lips of everyone around the world was what happened to Assad, the ousting of Bashar al-Assad. One of the most important things you need to note about this war is how al-Jilani approached it. Instead of following the same tactics of many other terror groups, al-Jilani continued to emphasize peace and inclusivity once HTS took over. This not only helped many conflicts be resolved without any blood being spilled, but gave hope to many civilians who were constantly suppressed. Unfortunately, not everyone was spared this luxury, and many top officials in the Assad regime were executed in public. However, at the top of the list was Assad himself. But where is the man whose family had ruled Syria for 54 years? Well, there are numerous reports, but many of them are still pure speculation. Some reports suggest that he had fled to Russia, especially with Russian President Vladimir Putin granting him immediate asylum. Unfortunately, there have been no concrete reports of Assad's whereabouts, and with trust in the legacy media now at an all-time low, no one truly knows who and what to trust. Perhaps he might eventually pop up in Russia at some point. However, an even more important question is what will happen to Syria next? The future of Syria. One of the scariest things to keep in mind is that Syria is currently in a state of chaos. Whilst it had been for decades, Assad managed to keep things under control even though his tactics might be frowned upon. Al-Jilani, the leader of the HTS-led coalition, is currently saying all the right things. He has asked to open numerous borders to Turkey to bring fleeing migrants back, and he has assured that many Syrian army forces would be given full amnesty, despite many horrific war crimes committed under the Assad regime. One big problem is the fact that al-Jilani has close ties to IS and al-Qaeda, which has sparked fears of a new caliphate perhaps rising to fruition. But al-Jilani has currently not hinted at such a move, suggesting a Syria that will be free for everyone. However, the authoritarian leadership style in HTS might make this much harder than anticipated. Moreover, HTS is also a designated terror organization by many Western countries, which does pose a threat to countries like Israel. Fortunately, the IDF has already taken advantage of the chaos. During the events of this 10-day war, the IDF noticed that they could target Syrian military targets without any opposition. Whilst the Syrian army was preoccupied with HTS, IDF soldiers slowly marched into the Golan Heights, a stretch of land creating the border between Israel and Syria. Thanks to carefully planned airstrikes and a few naval interventions, the IDF claims to have completely wiped out the Syrian Air Force and Navy. Some speculation even suggests that biological weapons were targeted. Now, it is important to note that Israel is still unsure of how HTS and its allies will operate the country. Perhaps it is a wise move to eliminate any weapons which might pose a threat later down the line. Finally, Russia and Iran are currently the two biggest losers. Due to the significant losses imposed on Iran by Israel, the regime had nothing to help the Assad regime with. The same goes for Russia, who are facing heavy losses in Ukraine. Whilst it is not yet confirmed, as of the creation of this video, it does seem as if Russia is still controlling both bases in the country. For how long, it remains to be seen. The fall of Assad is perhaps one of the most biggest moments in the Middle East for decades. His reign of terror has damaged the lives of millions and even caused havoc for many Western countries. Perhaps al-Jilani and his HTC-led coalition might be the answer. But with significant ties to many terror groups, things might get worse. Will we have another Taliban situation, or does al-Jilani have pure intentions? Let us know in the comments.